back to the Quran again, so I'm wearing a brown shirt, or at least has brown in it. Rule of thumb, if you're seeing me wearing brown, I'm usually going to be talking about scripture, revealed text, supposedly holy text, the Quran, the Bible, other pieces of text. If I'm wearing green, I'm usually talking about the origins of Islam. Now, not always, but I try to keep to that just so people don't get confused. So let's get back to the Quran, because the big elephant in the room concerns the earliest manuscripts, concerns the fact that when the Quran was created by Uthman in 652, he sent it to 5 cities, and that's why they were sent there so that there would be no corruption of other dialects or other scripts or other texts. To preserve the Quran in its Quraishi dialect, it was sent to those 5 cities, and yet we can't find them today. We cannot find any of them today. They just don't exist. Oh, there are scraps here and scraps there. I put up one about 63 fragments that they seem to have come up with in the 1st century of Islam, but some of them are just a verse here, a verse here, a verse there, and we don't even know the dates on an awful lot of them. There is the problem. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Well, here comes somebody to the rescue. EuroPG, after I put up this material on the 63 fragments, says this: you have to take in consideration the Mongol invasion. The Mongol invasion is 1220 to 1260 by Genghis Khan, his grandson Hulegu, and then others. They are the ones that we're talking about. So we're talking about the 13th century. The Mongols who came in and invaded that places like Baghdad and Damascus, and came down and destroyed all the manuscripts in Samarkand, and we're going to get into that. This is the claim that he's making. And look what he says here: the Mongol invasion, where the fact that they destroyed millions of books, millions, not tens, not 20s, not hundreds, not thousands, millions of Qur'ans. I love that exaggeration. But nonetheless, let's just go with what he's saying. And then he goes on and says, and the Spanish Inquisition and their destruction of the Islamic text. Well, the Spanish Inquisition was from 1478 to 1834, so we're talking about way, way, way too late. And also, remember, look and see where Spain is on a map. It's way, way off to the west. Way off to the west. So pretty much we can throw that out, because there was no real early manuscripts that I know of. I don't know of any reference of any manuscripts that are from the 7th and 8th or 9th century over in Spain. Let's throw that right out the window, because why are we even talking about the Spanish Inquisition? The Spanish Inquisition, as I recall, was not interested in books, and I don't recall them destroying any of the Quranic manuscript. There's no reference to it, so let's just not even deal with the Spanish Inquisition. It's too late, too far away, and it had no early Qurans. The early Qurans would have been in what is today Iraq, what is today Syria, what is today Saudi Arabia, that part of the world, what is today Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, these areas of the world. And that's what we're going to hone in on, because the Mongol invasion is the area I'd like to pick up, because that is the one that most Muslims, whenever I talk about manuscripts that cannot be preserved, they keep on bringing that up. Oh, the Mongols destroyed all the manuscripts, especially in Baghdad, The manuscript that existed in the 13th century there, they threw them into the Tigris River, and the rivers there were so many Qurans that the ink colored the water black, and that you could walk across them, according to the legends of the sacking of Baghdad. So let's get into it. Let's go into it. And what I'd like to do is first start out with what we do know about how, or what the Islamic tradition says. Let's use Zoom right now, and I'm going to use a Zoom fragment right here to look at a map, because I want to show you a map of what the Islamic traditions tell us happened. The Islamic traditions from the 9th and 10th century, let's go and see what they say, how the Quran was first put together. Okay, let's do it. We'll go to Zoom. According to the Islamic traditions from the 9th and 10th century, the Quran was first created in Medina. There you can see Medina on your screen in green. Used to be called Yathrib, then was changed to the name Medina, which just means city in Arabic. Uthman commissioned Zayd ibn Thabit to rewrite the Quran in around 652 AD. And from that original copy from 652 AD. This is according to Islamic traditions. Uthman then sent it to 5 cities, one being Medina. The other was there in Mecca, where you can see I put the arrow down there. Then over to the east, over to Basra, which is today in present-day Iraq. From there up to Kufa, which is just northwest on the Euphrates River. And then from there all the way over to Syria, to Damascus. So those are the 5 cities. Medina, where it originated, to Mecca, to Basra, to Kufa, and to Damascus. This is what the Islamic traditions tell us. Yet here's the problem. We do know that Damascus was first conquered by, according to traditions, this is traditions, was first conquered by Umar in 634. So 634 to 652. Well, you can see that's just 18 years. So how in the world did they get an entire Quran that early in their dialect in just 18 years, when it was primarily, if you look at at what existed there in Damascus, it was a Christian city to begin with. Aramaic was the language that was used. Even the Muslims were the minority, and Arabic was not introduced that early. Arabic took a while for Arabic to be introduced because of the fact of the Aramaic that already was there. That was the official language. It was Muawiyah not till 661. This is after Uthman. In 661, Muawiyah then made it his capital. But he was still a minority. They were still a minority even at that time. So how can you get a fully fledged Quran from a completely different dialect in Damascus in 652? That's even before Muawiyah. It was Abdul Malik then who then made in 685. So he comes to power in 685. He makes then Arabic the official language of the Umayyads. But that's 685, not 652. We're talking over 30 years later. That's the problem with Damascus. Let's look at Kufa. There you can see Kufa there. It was founded in 638. It was adjacent to the Lakhmid city of Hira. That used to be where Hira used to be. And you can see if it was founded in 638, it's got much the same problem in Damascus. It would have been too early. It's too far away and it was just beginning as a city. It didn't even exist as a city. So how could it be an official place to have a Quran by the time of 652? All right, 14 years later. Basra was also founded in the same year, 638. There you've got another problem. So here you have Basra, Kufa, and Damascus up in the north already having Qurans being officialized and becoming part of their history, when they've only been in the Arab or the Muslim realm, according to traditions, 14 to 18 years earlier. Baghdad, you notice, is not on that note because Baghdad didn't even exist. Baghdad was not even created till 762, and that's why I don't have it on the map there. 762, that's the mid-8th century. That's over 100 years later. So we're not even going to talk about Baghdad. We're just going to talk about Mecca, Medina, Basra, Kufa, and Damascus. Right. Now, so you can see the difficulty we have here is Medina, Mecca, Basra, Kufa, and Damascus. Well, those are not part of the Mongol Empire. Or are they? Well, let's see what really happened in the Mongol Empire. Let's look at a map again. I'm going to go back to Zoom and show you what the history tells us happened amongst the Mongols. Now, as far as the Mongol expansion west, the Mongols were way up here in Karakoram. That was their headquarters, and that was where they left or emanated from. Karakoram up there on the far right side. We do know that in the 1200s or the 12th century, around 1220, Genghis Khan then left there and he moves down to Khojend and to Urgench. Khojend, as for those who we don't know, Khojend or Khojend, I don't know if I pronounce it right, is in what is today Tajikistan, and Urgench or Urgench would be in what is today Uzbekistan. And then from there, they went to Bukhara, Uzbekistan. There's Bukhara there, Uzbekistan. And then down to Samarkand, which is also in Uzbekistan. Now, what was interesting, according to what we know about Genghis Khan in the Mongol invasion, they were not interested in destroying books or destroying people, so to say. They were much more interested in booty. They wanted cattle, they wanted camels, they wanted slaves. So as they would come into these cities, like Khojend and Urgench and Bukhara and Samarkand, they were interested in that type of booty. And they pretty much said they allowed cities to surrender peacefully. If they surrendered peacefully, they didn't pillage them. And that happened in Bukhara in 1220 and also happened in Samarkand in 1220, the same year. The next year, however, in Merv in 1221, which is in present day, let's put Merv here, there's Merv there, that's in what is today Turkmenistan. They did not surrender peacefully, and so Genghis Khan just destroyed. He tossed Qur'ans from the wooden cages to make feeding troughs for his horses. It says he trampled at the torn text beneath their feet. Doesn't mean that they were destroyed, but they were certainly damaged. And the place was ransacked, and the buildings mined, and the books burned or buried. So in Merv, we do know that the books were destroyed. Qur'ans, I'm sure, were part of that, because we're now in the 13th century, 1221. From there, he went to Nishapur, where there was not a ransacking because they surrendered quite peacefully. And then we get then to Baghdad. Baghdad. Now, Baghdad was not the powerful city it had been in the 8th, 9th, especially in the 10th century. We're now in the 13th century. It was starting to decline. But nonetheless, this is where most Muslims today say that the manuscripts, the Qur'ans, were destroyed. And in 1258, Hulegu, however you pronounce his name, is the grandson of Genghis Khan. So he comes in 1258. So about 30 years later, he comes. Remember, Genghis Khan died in 1227. So we're now in 1258, 20 to 30 years later. And Hulegu, his grandson, he promised the Qadis, that's the judges and the scholars and the religious leaders, including the historians, that they would all be safe if they did not resist, which is what any conqueror would do. And so therefore, the city's clergy, like the Shias and the Sunnis and the Christians, they were told this. They had enough time. If they had had any religious books that they would want to protect, they would have got them out of there before Hulegu came. But here's what's interesting. Hulegu's wife was a Nestorian Christian. And so she pretty much had an awful lot to say on what happened to the religious texts. Now, from Baghdad, we're going to hear about this city here, Marageh. I'm going to hold it there. Just look at it because that is important to everything we're going to talk about next. But from there, Baghdad, then Hulegu and those after him went on over to Damascus over here, and then finally came down to this city here, Ain Jalut, and that's where they were stopped. So that is as far as the Mongols were able to go, down to Ain Jalut, which is in present-day Israel, Damascus, present-day Syria. That's what we're looking at now. Take a look at that map, look at those red arrows, and that's where the Mongol hordes came. You notice what's missing on this map. Well, let me show you what's missing. Medina, Mecca, Basra, and Kufa. The four cities that the original manuscripts went to. They're not in anywhere the Mongols came. The Mongols didn't come anywhere towards Kufa or Basra or Medina or Mecca. So those manuscripts would not have been destroyed by any Mongols. We're going to come back to this map because this is the map that we're going to keep referring to because of what did happen in Baghdad. Okay, so you can see the map. It shows you very clearly that these Mongols coming in the 1200s or the 13th century, and they come to Khojend in what is today Tajikistan. They come down to Urgench in Uzbekistan. They go to Bukhara in Uzbekistan. Also we have Samarkand also in Uzbekistan. And in those cities, Khojend, Urgench, I want to get it right, Urgench, Bukhara and Samarkand, there was no sacking, no destruction, because the people pretty much just gave in and let the Mongols come through. It was in Merv, where the real problem existed. And it was in Merv, in what is today Turkmenistan, where the sacking and the destruction and possibly some Qur'ans may have been destroyed at that time. And then from there they went to Nishapur. But it is Baghdad I want to talk about today. It is Baghdad. Why? Because it is in Baghdad that we get these references of destruction. Remember, the Mongols were not really interested in religious texts. They were not really even interested in people. What they were interested was booty. They were interested in booty, made up of cattle, camels, and slaves. So this idea that they went around destroying manuscripts is not part of the historical record. Usually they allowed cities to surrender peacefully, and then they didn't pillage them. That's why in most of those cities I just named, they didn't. The only place that we know where there was pillaging was in Merv, where they tossed Qur'ans from their wooden cases to make feeding troughs for their horses, according to what we hear, and they trampled the torn text beneath their teeth. That means the horses trampled torn text beneath their feet. So they were not intentionally trying to destroy. They were in the way, and they overturned their troughs so they could use them for other means. And of course, the horses stepped all over them. Now that means they were damaged, not that they were destroyed purposely. It's when you get to Baghdad, and now Hulegu takes over, because Genghis Khan had died in 1227. Hulegu, now his grandson, was in charge, and he is the one that goes into Baghdad. Now, according to the historical record, this is what we know. He has a wife who is a Nestorian Christian, so an ear from his wife on any type of religious text. But more than that, what he does, he promised the Qadis, these are the judges, and he also promised the scholars and the religious leaders, including the Nestorians, as his wife was a Nestorian Christian, that they would all be safe if they did not resist, which is normal when you ever going to conquer a city. Therefore, the city's clergy, which made up both Shia and Sunni and Christian, they would have had enough time. If there were any texts at that time that needed to be protected, they would have had enough time to then sequester them and get them out of the city. Nonetheless, what is interesting is, according to what I hear Muslims tell me, according to the narrative that has come and I've grown up with, was that in Baghdad they destroyed tens of hundreds of thousands of Qur'ans. In 1258, when they attacked Baghdad, this is what I've always heard, the Mongol hordes destroyed Baghdad and its 36 public libraries. The pillagers tearing books apart so the leather covers could be used for sandals. That's the first myth. Second myth that has always been repeated. So many books were thrown into the Tigris River that they formed a bridge that would support men on horseback. And the water turned black with the ink from the books. Those are the two myths I've always heard, and those are the two myths that our good friend Europg is talking about. Where does this come from? Well, a man named Yusuf Chowdhury back in 2019, so 2 years ago, wrote a article called Examining the Tigris River of Ink. And he took his material from a European scholar named Edward G. Brown, who was writing in 1906. So we're talking about a little over 100 years ago. In 1906, this is what he wrote. The sack of Baghdad began on February the 13th, 1258, and lasted for a week, during which 800,000 of the inhabitants were put to death, while the treasures, material, literary, and scientific accumulated during the centuries, while Baghdad was the metropolis of the vast empire of the Abbasid caliphs, and they were plundered or destroyed. The loss suffered by Muslim learning, which never again reached its former level, defies description and almost surpasses imagination. Not only were thousands of priceless books utterly annihilated, but owing to the number of men of learning who perished or barely escaped with their lives, the very tradition of accurate scholarship and original research, so conspicuous in Arabic literature before this period, was almost destroyed. Never, probably, was so great and splendid of civilization so swiftly consumed with fire and quenched with blood. So where is Edward G. Brown getting his source for all this? Well, it's interesting because the earliest source is a Muslim source from 1302 named Ibn Taktaki, who writes Kitab al-Fikri, and it's in his book Kitab al-Fikri, written in 1302. So we're talking 44 years after the siege of Baghdad. He writes this. Let's see what he writes and see if this parallels what Brown is saying in 1906. So here's what Taktaki says. They invested Baghdad on every side. This is the Mongols. Then they began to make use of the methods of siege, and the caliph's army to repel and to oppose until the 90th day of Muharram, when the people suddenly saw the Mongol standards appear on the wall of Baghdad by the tower called the Persian Tower, near one of the gates of Baghdad, called Galudi Gate. This tower was the shortest of the towers of the wall. The Sultan's army effected an entry by storm. There ensued a sudden slaughter and great looting, the brief statement of which would shock the hearer. How much more, therefore, recapitulation in detail. Things happened which I shall not record. Imagine them. Do not ask for a description. The Sultan ordered the Caliph with his women and children to be brought out to him. So they went out. The Caliph presented himself before the Mongol emperor, and it is said that he was reprimanded and blamed in terms which amounted to an accusation against him of weakness, incompetence, and carelessness. Then he and his grown-up children were referred to the Mongol code, whilst his daughters were made prisoners. Then Al-Mustasim suffered martyrdom in the 4th of Safar in the year 656 AH. So, that's the earliest record we have of the sacking of Baghdad. Anything about destroying Qur'ans or books or throwing them into the Tigris? So many that they could walk across them. They made a bridge they could walk across, and that the ink created a river of black. Any of that in the earliest sources? No. The Muslim source for these myths, these two myths, come from Ibn Khaldun, and that is who Edward G. Brown is actually quoting. He doesn't quote Ibn Taktaki. He quotes Ibn Khaldun, who is writing just before he dies in 1406. So that's 148 years after the siege. Not 44 years like Taktaki. This is over 100 years later. He is the one that introduces this myth about the river turning black, and so many books that they could walk across. This was then repeated by Al-Kalkashandi in 1418, which was then repeated by Ibn Tagri-Birdi in 1470, and then by Al-Isami in 1699. So in the 15th and then the 17th century, this is repeated for that which is happening in the 13th century. Can you see the problem? Once the myth starts, it just gets repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated, and then finally picked up in 1906 by Edward G. Brown, the European, who then just assumes that Ibn Khaldun knew what he was talking about. Ibn Khaldun knew nothing about what he was talking about. Why? So Ibn Khaldun, it looks like, this is an anti-Mongol polemic. This is typical of people you don't like. You may do a polemic against them. So in the 1400s, he is trying to show that 200 years earlier, 150 years earlier, this is what really happened. This is what really happened. But he's 150 years too late. There are other primary sources that are much earlier. Let's go back to those primary sources that describe the siege of Baghdad, but they do not mention any destruction of any books. Such as, who are we talking about? Well, Bar Hebraeus, who writes about the sacking of Baghdad in 1286. So that's just really 30 years later. You have Rashid al-Din al-Hamadani, who writes just before 1318. So we're talking about within 50 to 60 years after this happens, neither Rashid, Hamadani, or Hebraeus talk about a destruction of any books. Why don't they talk about a destruction of any books? Why does none of the historians from the 13th and 14th century not talk about any destruction of any books? And this only begins to appear in the 15th century with Ibn Khaldun. There's a reason for it. And here's the reason. The reason has to do with a man named Nasir al-Din al-Tusi. Remember that name, Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, who dies in 1274. Remember the sacking of Baghdad is in 1258. So this is roughly, well, this is just a few years after that. Ata Malik Juwaini in 1283, that's 25 years after the sacking of Baghdad, writes this. And he says that Hulegu, who is the grandson of Genghis Khan, Hulegu, who is the Mongol, besieged the Ismaili castle El Alamut, northwest of Tehran. Juwani writes that he suggested that the valuable books ought not to be destroyed, which Hulegu agreed. So it looks like Hulegu did not like to destroy books. We see this happening there at the Alamut castle. So what happened to the books? Well, Al-Safadi tells us. He writes in 1363, and he writes this: Nasr al-Din al-Tusi built a magnificent dome and observatory in Marageh. Where's Marageh? Let's put it up on the map again. It's the one in blue. It's in Iran. It's to the northeast of Baghdad. So he builds this beautiful observatory in Marageh, or also known as Maragah, south of Tabriz in Iran. And he made in it a large, expansive library and filled it with books that were taken from Baghdad, they were taken from Syria, and they were taken from upper Mesopotamia, until there were over 400,000 volumes gathered there. Later on, in 1442, Al-Makrizi also describes Hulegu building the observatory for Al-Tusi and the transfer of books to it. In 2010, so now we're talking about a number of years ago, just 11 years ago, Abbas Ali Shameli writes this about what happened back then. This library by Al-Tusi was composed of more than 400,000 volumes collected from different cities like Transoxania, from Khorasan, from Baghdad, from Mosul and Damascus, which were the victims of the early Mongols' invasion. The library of Maragah, or Marageh, contained a considerable number of books, since it was a collection of the writings from all of these places, including Baghdad, including Damascus, and including the Arabian Peninsula. So it looks like all of these Qur'ans were saved because Hulegu, who had a wife who was a Christian, put a bug in his ear saying, don't destroy the manuscripts, knowing that the biblical manuscripts would be destroyed as well, because the Mongols were neither Christian nor were they Muslim. They had their own domestic religions. Some of them took on these religions once they settled down there, but they were not interested in destroying manuscripts. They were interested in booty. They were interested in gaining land and getting cattle and getting camels and getting wealth, and yes, even slaves. So you can see why this is nothing more than a myth. Why? Because when you look at the historical record, you need to go back to the historical record. What about Damascus? Well, we showed Damascus. We'll show it again on the map. It was attacked and conquered in 1260. It submitted to the Mongol of Ketbuka, not Hulegu. Now we're into Ketbuka. And so there was no destructions of any Qur'ans there. We know if there had been Qur'ans there, they had already been taken over to Marageh. And then the Mongols came down to Ain Jalut. Let's put it on the map. Look at it again. Ain Jalut is in Palestine. That was also the same year, 1260, in Galilee. And that was the new Mamluk Sultan Saif al-Din Qutuz, who then stopped them there. And that, as far as the Mongols went, they went no further. They went no further than what is today Israel, which means they never penetrated Jerusalem. They never got to Cairo. They never got to Mecca. They never got to Medina, and they never got to Yemen. They never got to any of these other places where there would have been manuscripts. Now, let's bring this to a conclusion. Can you see the problem here? It looks like, yes, we do know the Mongols were a bloodthirsty people. We do know that they did take over countries, they took over cities, and they did eradicate those who stood against them. However, those who submitted, they didn't. They didn't destroy anything, nor people, nor books. And that we find that in places like Bukhara and Samarkand and other places. But a place like Merv, it was destroyed, and possibly some books were destroyed in Merv. Western scholars, like our good friend Euro PG, who claim that the Mongols destroyed books, and they destroyed so many that the river of the Tigris turned to black from the ink, and there were so many books that you could even walk, it being made a natural bridge. That is nothing more than a myth that was created by Ibn Khaldun as a polemic against the Mongols, and he did that in the 1400s. But if you look at the earlier writers, if you look at Taktaki in 1302, 100 years earlier, he is very clear that all of these books, all of these manuscripts, they were sequestered in Marageh. Why? Because of Nasr al-Din al-Tusi, who was given the responsibility to take these books, 400,000 of them, and sequester them away. Proving that much of what you're hearing about Baghdad and much of what you're hearing about these Qur'ans is nothing more than a myth. A myth that needs to be corrected. A myth that needs to be corrected. So, folks, we come back to the same problem again. The elephant is still in the room. He is not left. What about those earliest manuscripts? What about the manuscripts sent by Uthman down to Mecca, over to Basra and Kufa, and up to Damascus? Regardless if these have only been under their power for 14 to 18 years, not even 20 years where they're under their power. That is beside the fact. I'm just asking, if they were sent there for preservation, if they were sent there to make sure that there was no corruption, then where is there even one? And you cannot say that the Mongols anymore destroyed them. Don't even try to get the Inquisition into this, because that was much too late and too far away. I still am asking you Muslims, where are these manuscripts? Excuse after excuse after excuse. Thank God we don't make up excuses like this. So stop blaming the Mongols. They had nothing to do with your manuscripts. You've now got to find them and show them to us. We're still waiting. This is Jay, over and out.